Welcome to Talking with Tech. I'm your host, Rachel Madel, joined as always by Chris Bouguet. Hey, Chris.
How's it going, Rachel?
Good. What you got this week?
Are you having the best day ever, Rachel? Is this like the best time that you're having?
I always have the best day ever when I get to see you.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's so nice. Would you say this is better than yesterday and when we didn't get to chat and hang out?
Definitely.
Okay. You had to think about that one. All right. Here's why I asked and why I'm stressing the word best. Something that's been on my mind recently has been this term best practice. It's thrown around in pretty much every educational professional circle I know of. I would imagine it's thrown around in other professional circles as well. Like, well, this is best practice. And I hear it said so often, it got me really wondering, says who? Like, who gets to determine what's best practice? And when you're sitting at an IEP table or you're having a conversation with another professional and you hear them say the term best practice, what does that mean? How do we define it and who decides? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we hear this all the time and everyone's like kind of referencing this when they're trying to like make an argument for one thing versus another. It's like, well, this is best practice. And it's such a nebulous term that it's like floating around and, you know, nobody really knows what it means. And I feel like it's something that, depending on your experience and also your discipline, because we're kind of sitting around the table oftentimes at IEP meetings and we're with other professionals, I think that it becomes even more challenging because we all have different definitions of what it means.
Yeah, exactly. I could see a real powerful moment would be when someone throws out the term best practice in one of those meetings to stop and say, ask one of our reflective questions. Can you tell me what do you mean by best practice? Right? And could you define what you mean by best practice? Because it's such a nebulous term. The other thing that sort of has got me thinking about that is best practices, and I'm going to put that in air quotes again, is seems to evolve. You know, I guess at one point someone would have said electroshock therapy was a best practice, right? And then it evolves. So we wouldn't say that's a best practice. But when's the moment in time when something tips the scale from being the best practice to now knowing that we have a better practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, things are constantly changing. And so it's so subjective in nature. It's like, well, like compared to what? And it's also so personalized based on so many different factors of what this person thinks is best practice is different, what the person next to them thinks. And so, yeah, it's just, I think it's a way to, again, kind of showcase that you have the best perspective and this is the way to do things. And I think whenever people use that term, again, I think it's usually to try to convince people or to share that what I'm saying is quote unquote best practice, AKA the way you should do things. And I also think it's just, you know, and we've shared this before on the podcast, whenever you're trying to collaborate with people, like throwing around research, throwing around the phrase best practice, it just gets people ready for a fight. And it doesn't really support collaboration and it can make people quite defensive. And so I think that it's also kind of a loaded term, often the way that it's used, not always, but I think it can be used in that way too.
Maybe the better practice is to not use the term best practice. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm trying to think of a situation where I would say best practice and then what I could say instead. I mean, I guess I would just say the exact specific approach or idea that I'm sharing.
You know, I feel like that's where a lot of misunderstanding happens, is in less words rather than more words. So when we try and label something, think about any sort of, like a relationship, and you're like, well, we're boyfriend, girlfriend now. Well, wait, so what does that mean? And how do we define that? And how is that, right? It becomes more complicated. You need more words to describe how you're feeling and how people connect, right? And I feel like that's similar. Just throwing out the term best practice is throwing a label on something that might not even be true. So what, like you said, let's describe it. Let me describe what I'm thinking the action steps should be and give you evidence to back up my claims.
Yeah, I like that. I'm trying to think like when's the last time I used that? Obviously, I've said it in my life and my career. I tend not to use that a lot, generally speaking, mostly because I feel like I'm generally asking questions to people and I'm not kind of sharing what I think is the best quote unquote practice. But yeah, I think that ultimately just being more specific and sharing the exact thing that you're talking about makes more sense than to kind of like stick a label on it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we landed on it then, that we should maybe describe things more. Describing more is the better practice than just saying this is best practice. Is that a good way to summarize this banter?
I think so. And I think one thing I'd add to that is just kind of, I really believe in explaining a why behind it. So like if you're sharing something and you are thinking this is best practice, it's like, well, you know, we know that motor planning is important based off of the research that we have and also experiences from adults who use AAC. Like that would be a perfect example of how to share something and explain the why behind it. Because I think the why it gives really important context. And I think that's what gives the credibility, right? It's like, I don't have to say best practice. I can just say the specific things like research and AAC users, right?
Totally. I think what you're getting there is you're hinting at towards the evidence-based triangle that from the American Speech and Hearing Association, which we've talked about copious times on this podcast. But that is a way to back up your claims, is that if it checks off all three boxes.
Exactly.
Well, all right. Well, without further ado, I wonder if that's what they use in Malta. I don't think I asked Dr. Ajuis, who the interview is with today, but who I got an opportunity to meet during the Communication Matters Conference is Dr. May Ajuis, who's been working in assistive technology and AAC for a while, and she's going to describe her background. And she is in Malta. So let's listen to my interview about what AAC is like in Malta.
We'd like to thank all of the wonderful Patreon supporters who make this show possible. This podcast is funded by listeners just like you who've signed up at patreon.com/talkingwithtech to show their support. Because of the generosity of our amazing Patreon community, we're able to pay Luke and Michaela, our podcast producer and audio engineer, who keep the show looking and sounding great. Patreon supporters also receive bonus content, such as early access to interviews, behind-the-scenes recordings, additional curated resources and materials, and so much more. Check it out at patreon.com/talkingwithtech. Now let's head back into the episode.
Welcome to the Talking with Tech podcast. My name is Chris Bouguet, and I have the great honor of talking to Dr. Ajuis. So, Dr. Ajuis, you and I got to meet each other at the Communication Matters Conference back in 2024. And it just happened to be that we sat next to each other at one of the sessions and we were shoulder buddies and we just struck up a conversation. And you were like, oh, I live and work in Malta. And I was like, whoa, what's that like? And then we started talking about the podcast. One of the missions of the podcast is really to help people all across the world realize that many of the challenges that we face are global, And so the podcast has been going for about 7 years now, Dr. Ajuis, and we've had people from Australia and New Zealand, and just interviewed some people from Scotland and Canada, and the list goes on of different places. And now we'd like to add you and Malta to that list to get your input, your experience, and then also a little bit about what that's like in the country of Malta. So without further ado, let me ask you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so first I'm going to start with Malta, a tiny little island in the Mediterranean, for those of you maybe who aren't so familiar with it. My background is speech and language therapy. I completed my doctorate, or defended it, about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's in the field of AAC and autism. I also work with the World Health Organization. I'm appointed to their Assistive Technology Advisory Group. I'm a lecturer at the University of Malta, are doing all kinds of different things.
Wow. So something I hadn't heard before is the World Health Organization. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how you got involved and what that work is like?
Well, the World Health Organization is very interested in assistive technology in a more a broader sense, but of course, elements of AAC will fall under that. And they have something called the list of 50 priority assistive technology products, which they believe every country should have access to. It doesn't matter if you're a rich or a poor country. These are a list of products that every country should have. And these include things like wheelchairs, hearing aids, glasses, continence products, all sorts of things. And at this moment in time, they are revising this product list. And I applied to be on this advisory group. And so, of course, they are interested, I think, to have a speech and language therapist on this group, because a lot of times assistive technology is taken over by people from other backgrounds, professional backgrounds, physio, occupational therapy. So I'm very proud to have gone onto it. But I also think the timing was right. I was the right gender, and that's why I'm on this group, assistive technology. But I think we know that not all AAC is assistive tech, and particularly if we are referring to the use of the body to support communication, and that creates issues because it's not neat. Right, in terms of assessment, in terms of how we view AAC and the philosophy behind it. Because whether you work on a specialist AAC assessment team like I do, or not, you are always considering all forms of AAC, and multimodal communication is the way forward. Therefore, you can't refer to it as equals assistive tech.
Yeah. Okay. This is great because oftentimes the way I've described AAC is a subcomponent under assistive technology. But what you're saying is that's not really true. A great example, I think, is so I don't know if you have it there, Dr. Ajuis, but we have Disney Plus. Have you watched the Out of My Mind movie? Have you seen it yet?
No, but I will.
Okay,
yeah.
so
I've heard of it actually. I must. Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, move it to the top of your list because it's an awesome movie. But in that movie, there's a moment where there's minor spoiler, minor spoiler. But there's a moment where the Melody is the name of the character, is using augmentative communication for the first time in a general education classroom. She has a letterboard in front of her that she can use, but in order to answer the teacher's question, her arm drifts over and she points to a leaf on the wall to answer the question, who discovered America? Leif Erikson, right? She points to Leif. And I think that's your point, is that here we have a mode of communication that's not speaking, but it's not assistive technology. They're getting their point across. The students getting their point across by specifically gesturing towards, in this case, an object on the wall, right? And so I think is that a great example of what you're sort of mentioning?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So if I drew it like that, you've got assistive technology being the whole circle there, but you have an overlapping circle, and as a part of AAC, the unaided part, which falls outside of that. And like I said, there are a lot of advancements going on right now around assistive technology worldwide. When you look at the Sustainable Development Goals that are out there right now, UN's goals, there are about 14 or 15 of them. Assistive technology cuts across all of these in our achievement of those goals as a society. But like I said, it isn't just about assistive technology, because supporting people to communicate can happen in other ways.
Absolutely. Another analogy we use sometimes is how communication, the different ways anyone might communicate might be through emojis, for instance. Is that a form of symbolic communication that we use? Memes and GIFs, right, are a form of symbolic communication. So all of these are expanding our definition of what communication is and how we communicate.
I completely agree. I was going to say that recently I knew somebody who passed away, and you know how people will go on Facebook and they will all write something like condolences or sympathies. And it was very interesting because I couldn't think of a word, and then I chose a purple heart. And I thought, I wonder, did I send this because I'm coming from a field where we're so busy representing language with symbols that it was almost easier for me to think of a symbol than to think of the right words at that moment in time.
Absolutely. And, I think that skill is growing
Yeah.
in that. Well, I'll tell you two quick things. One, if you were to spend some time with teenagers, they are using a tool called Twitch. A lot of people
Yeah.
now watch video games or watch games, and then they are commenting on the side as they're watching these games or they're watching whatever is happening on Twitch. And the comment stream is a lot of times it's text, but oftentimes it's GIFs and emojis, sometimes emojis that are repeated over and over. And all of this is happening so quickly. It's almost like as fast as speech, depending on how many people are in the room, right? And it just scrolls by, but it's so much imagery, not just text. And it's like that shows me that the next generation is thinking more in pictures globally. Like we're all thinking more in pictures.
Yes.
And then for the second thing that I'll say there is whenever I'm doing like a webinar, especially if I'm in a group with people, I am conscientiously trying to use like, come on, adults, like let's start using emojis like the kids are, So I constantly am putting like little clappies or little faces, or if someone brings up something, I try and make a connection with some sort of emoji that I throw in there just to put more symbols in the world,
I think what we're talking about in a way is that, and this is a discussion I've had lots of times with people at work too, is that I don't know if you're a speech and language therapist like I am, but I believe that the way we teach at university is often enough that we want speech and language therapists to fix speech, to attain the perfect speech and language. And that is therefore the goal. When actually what we're talking about here is, I think, a shift. It's a huge mind shift towards actually it doesn't matter how you communicate as long as you get your message across, be it with a visual, be it using speech, writing something down, or using some other form of AAC. And therefore, rather than say that speech is the gold standard, and this is real medical model stuff, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Constantly saying, let's achieve this perfect thing because we're saying it's perfect to speak and that we should fix people and make them speak clearly. Really what we should be talking about is valuing all forms of communication equally. Therefore, AAC can never be a last resort and shouldn't be.
Absolutely. Again, this is why you and I hit it off so, when sitting next to each other at the Communication Matters conference. Because, yes, my background is speech. And the first 3 years of my career, I was a speech therapist at an elementary school. And something I could never wrap my brain around was, why am I spending my minutes helping a kid say their R's better? Now, if they want to say their R's, great, I'll help you. But otherwise, I should be helping the world just accept people who use W's for R's. Like, I understand what you're saying, dude. I understand what you're like. So this mind shift, I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm glad to hear that you're seeing it and have your foot on the gas to help the world get there sooner, right?
Well, I think if we're going to start being more accepting of difference in every respect, we're seeing this in many areas now, then we also need to accept that people are going to be different in the way they communicate. And I think that's going to require a huge shift in the way we train therapists moving forward. It is okay for someone not to speak clearly. It is okay for someone to speak differently to me or to use different ways of communicating.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, it's becoming mainstream, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, it continues to grow in that regard, that more people are thinking about all the different ways we communicate. Let me ask you this. How did you get interested in AAC in the first place?
I worked in Ireland for the first 14 years of my professional career. And just before I went backpacking for a year, I got the opportunity to do the Assistive Technology course. So it's run by an NGO called Enable Ireland. They have a specialist AAC team in conjunction with Microsoft as well. They're kind of half involved at the time. And so I got qualified there. There aren't really many assistive technology courses in Europe as there would be in America. And I got qualified. And then I went backpacking for a year. And that was it. But by chance, I was visiting my parents here in Malta, somewhere during this year off. And I saw an advert for a job. Didn't know what it was for, applied, went for an interview and found out it was for an AT team. And I was like, yes. Right. But I think I've been working a long time now. And I think at that time I was one of the few people who was very comfortable with tech. in any way, shape, or form. We are talking of a time when I did my thesis on a typewriter, a word processor, right? And, not on a, or laptops had just come out, something like this, and a lot of the people qualified at that time weren't comfortable with tech and supporting kids using tech. And around that time, really, there was only Big Macs. And then there was those books of Mayor Johnson symbols. That was way back. And so I think that from that kind of group of people, very few people really wanted to get in AAC. It was an alien world. It was, and I think even today, because I lecture at university, and we have very small groups, like 14, 15, and of those, which ones are never going to work in this field or should never work in this field. And I would say from 15, you're lucky if there's one who just has that mind that can appreciate how to solve a problem, how to be creative about it, how to just have fun in the moment in terms of communicating with people, and it doesn't matter how it's done. I think there's a certain type of person who comes into this field. I really do.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that in that, I have friends that they're educators, but they learned to be educators, right? They didn't grow up with the sort of educator mindset or sort of an inclusive mindset. So some people, I feel like it just comes natural in the same way for some people, it comes natural to kick a soccer ball, just comes natural that you accept 4 different forms of communication. And then there's a larger swath of people that need to learn that skill. Yeah. And then sadly, there's, I think, the other end of this bell curve is people who will never, no matter how much you try to convince them and teach them and educate them. I like to believe that we'll get everybody, but there's probably people at that far, far end that will never change,
Well, I think like I said, it goes back a little bit to the core ethos of how someone is educated in the field, in the profession. And apart from the fact that some people just aren't problem solvers, and I do think that every case, if you're a good therapist, every child or adult that you see with a communication need, you approach afresh. There is no recipe, there is no formula. And I enjoy that, but a lot of people don't. They want to go to work, they want to sit down, ABC, and off we go. Whereas for me, it's like if I did ABC, I would be very bored. So I like the whole idea of thinking it through. And I think AAC in itself is such a complex field in terms of how you conduct an assessment, how you synthesize all the bits of information you get that come from so many different places. And that is different to typical speech and language work, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And just to make this clear, the problem solving that you're talking about is not necessarily fixing the person, but the environment, the communication, right? Yeah. But because I think some people do get into the field thinking, this person is a problem. They're a puzzle, for instance, and I have to solve them and figure it out. That's not the problem solving you're talking about. You're talking about this person has abilities. What tech can I use to amplify those abilities and help them, right? And how can I help people in their environment help them do that with technology and or other things? Like, how can we change things in the environment? That's the sort of problem solving that I think you're getting at.
The whole thing, because a lot of times I meet the child, we use some systems, he demonstrates that he could use that system tomorrow, today, now. And then I'm looking at the parents or someone else who's come and I'm like, okay, we're going to have a problem here. And then if you don't address that side of it, then equally you're likely to have abandonment or not achieve the goals or the outcomes that you want. So and that's what's fun though. That's what I like, finding where the problem is and seeing where I can support to get that successful outcome, which at the end of the day is just communicating. Something that we take for granted. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, since you mentioned this was a couple of years ago, your thesis? Tell us a little bit about your doctorate and getting your thesis. What was that like? So
I'm the senior speech and language therapist. That's what we refer to in Malta, here on the National Assistive Technology Team in Malta. Most of our work is AAC. When I was employed, I was the first speech therapist on this team, had been set up by a teacher who recognized that she needed to get now therapists on the team, and the interviews were held and I came in. And I remember starting and saying, what are your eligibility criteria? This is a really important thing because a lot of times our own services gatekeep, and we don't provide services to everyone. And she didn't have it. She didn't know what I was talking about. She was a teacher. And I remember then, you don't realize it at the time, but the monumental decisions that get taken. At that time, it was like, well, if this person has difficulty speaking, then who am I to say they shouldn't come for this service? There is no other service because Malta's small and we were the only team doing this work. So as a result, we have something like 70% of our referrals are autistic children. They've been coming to us for years. But of course, one of the biggest issues we always had was, one, this child can say some words. Does he need AAC? Two, this child has difficulties knowing how to communicate. How do I help him? And those two things are so specific to autism, I think. And so obviously then when I got the chance first to do a master's, because in Europe we were working as speech therapists with basic degree, undergraduate degree. I did that master's on autism. And that research was a comparison between PECs and use of dynamic display to teach a child to request. That one is published. So it's published in the AAC journal. Found no difference. That was the first. So that was adding on to the idea that it doesn't matter if it's low or high tech that you start with. But then when I came to my PhD, I was really interested in visual scene displays and trying to understand, would they make a difference for a child with autism? Really thinking they probably wouldn't, because bit haphazard, and you start to think, for a child with autism who probably prefers predictability, what will visual scene displays do? I found no difference. The parents didn't like the visual scene displays at all, right? And I really struggled to get published because I was going against a whole bunch of people. Well, one or two people who had a lot published who kept saying that these were better. And I was like, I found no difference. Here's my evidence. Right? Uh-huh. I have just been published. Finally got it published again in AAC, in the journal there. But, a PhD is a journey. Started off with this. After about 2 years, myself and my supervisory team were like, well, this isn't going anywhere. There is no difference between these different ways of representing vocabulary on displays. And then we started to look more at sensory processing, because that's what interested us. The children who took part in the study who weren't really doing well, the ones I wasn't able to teach. And here I am, the best therapist in the world. And I couldn't, and why was that? And we started to hypothesize it was because we weren't addressing sensory needs. And so by the end of the PhD, what we started to look at was, okay, are there certain kinds of sensory processing difficulties that are more likely to impact someone's ability to learn AAC? And how do we tackle that? So what we were coming up with were things like, okay, for children who demonstrate profiles that are quite low arousal, we needed to get in there, provide sensory processing interventions. And I work with an occupational therapist who could help with this. And what we were doing is providing that kind of intervention first and then going for the AAC afterwards. For children who were very over-aroused on the go the whole time, what we were looking at was how we could regulate the environment to support them to be at that place where they could learn how to use AAC. So all that was documented, and eventually I will publish all bits of it. It's something you need time to do, isn't it? I think we've looked at AAC. We are trying to understand how to teach children with autism to use it, the ones who are in very early stages. And I think we don't know enough. And this is maybe one factor that I think is very important, and that maybe as speech therapists, we haven't been considering as much as we could.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes sort of a lot of sense of why we'd be thinking about AAC as a interdisciplinary practice, and that we should be involving physical therapists, occupational therapists, because it's a whole child or a whole person approach. And if you're dysregulated, then are you going to be as effective in communicating as if you are not, right? And so what can you do to help become regulated, right? I mean, it sounds like you've that this is something we need to promote even more.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is I heard a few presentations about this at Isaac at the Gold Coast, but when you go looking for actual printed evidence, that's been peer reviewed, you won't find much. So maybe people just haven't gotten around to doing these kinds of studies yet. I've done a couple and want to get them peer reviewed at this point. The first one has been reviewed, but I've got 2 more that I need to now look into getting published. Because I think we need to be more cognizant of how we work, and speech and language therapists don't know everything. We do have boundaries to our knowledge. I learned a lot from occupational therapists, like the use of the self. They talk about this in therapy, right? How you yourself are a therapeutic tool. And I touched on that also in my thesis, because understanding how to use yourself to connect with the child with autism can be instrumental to being able to teach them how to then communicate.
Do you mean, like, for instance, kids sitting on a beanbag chair? I sit down next to them in a similar beanbag chair, shoulder to shoulder, like you and I at Communication Matters, as opposed to I'm going to sit across for them and maybe point to something for them to do, right? Where my physicality is next to them and I'm not. Is that what you mean by using your body and yourself?
I mean that you find how you are going to connect with that child, and it's probably not going to be with that picture that you're asking them to point to.
Right.
Right. It's most often going to be something some joint thing that you can enjoy together. If there's no enjoyment, there cannot be communication. Let's be honest. I mean, and that child who is, as we've already discussed, probably sensory dysregulated, distracted by everything else, or is so underregulated that you don't register as a person to them. Can you imagine what that's like? And then you come along with an AAC system.
Yeah. And
going. Yeah.
And oftentimes that intervention, I guess in the past, would be, and maybe in many places still, compliance driven. Touch this thing to get this other thing, or you're done with break now. I'm going to tell you what to do. Get up. It's time to go. And so it's not fun. You're not really making a connection. Or the connection you're making, the relationship is one of power, or a power dynamic, as opposed to let's play with our Legos together and build something, and oh no, it fell, and now we're laughing because the thing fell, or look at how tall I made my thing, or whatever the thing is that you're connecting over in a fun way.
Do you know what? I think there are a lot of therapists out there who already do this. They just don't know that they're doing something that is probably better than some other therapists who move towards more what we just spoke about. So these things aren't always documented, or you won't find them in the literature when you go look for them. But that's kind of where my PhD went, because it's so obvious, and yet at the same time, and I get calls from therapists, saying to me, May, I don't know what to do with this child. And then when I start to ask what's going on, they're like, oh, we're not compliant. Not compliant? What's that mean? Does that mean that you're struggling to connect with this child on some level? Have you tried other ways, or are you asking them to sit at a table and do what you want the whole time?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's really interesting because this conversation is supposed to be about AAC, and yet, it's an intervention that if you don't think about these basic things, you will struggle to be successful, especially with children who are autistic.
Absolutely. You yourself as the therapist will be frustrated, not feeling like you're doing a good job because you're not. And you might be looking for alternatives in occupations. Like maybe this isn't for me, as opposed to coming home going, oh my gosh, guess what I did today? I played Legos. And because we played Legos, we learned some words together. Like having a fun experience yourself will increase your longevity. It keeps us young, Dr. Ajuis.
Yeah, it does.
Let me ask you this. So let's talk about your day-to-day a little bit. What does that look like in Malta?
As I said, we're the National Assistive Technology Team, and we're a small team. And I think, like most teams across the world, we struggle to recruit the right people. It's just so hard to get people who want to work in this field. So that's, as a team, I think I would say we're under pressure massively to see the people that refer to us. One of the things that we have going for us, or not going for us, is a charity who's gotten involved with funding our equipment, but in doing so has put a spotlight on us, and now we have referrals like you will not believe. Good and bad thing. In Maltese, translated to English, it would be a knife that cuts from both sides. Because on the one side, you're hitting more people on the other side, the demand is higher than what we can cope with. So we're very busy. Plus, we are a research team. Like most teams like ours are, we believe that our role is to contribute to the field of AAC. So research is ongoing within our team. We also work with some of the schools. We do still have special schools in Malta. And with those, you take more of a whole school approach. So we're doing an awful lot of training for schools, apart from seeing kids. And recently we expanded to adults too. And that's a new group of people that are coming in. For us, we are seeing people with acquired conditions. We are seeing people with deteriorating conditions and trying to see how we can get them up and running before they reach that point where they can't cope. And again, over there as well, it's high demand. People want that kind of service too. So yeah, really busy day. Go to work at 7, finish at 3.
Let me ask you a clarifying question here. So here in the States, we have different school districts, and I work for a school district that has an assistive technology team. I'm the specialist on our team. But what you're saying in Malta is you have one team for the entire country, the National Assistive Technology Team. And is that from birth to, is it the whole lifespan? Gotcha.
Now, yes.
It is now. And how big is your team?
I have just hired 2 speech therapists. So now we have 4 speech therapists and 2 OTs. We cannot get OTs on our team. We still manage to do a lot of evaluations per year. But partly because some of us are very experienced and maybe we take less time to do them. That makes sense. But, you know, we're also involved in other projects. Another example is I'm a board member for the European Association of Service Providers for People with Disabilities. This year, yes, on the Day of Disabilities, I think it was yesterday or it was recent, and they announced they're going to push on the European agenda that assistive technology centres are set up in every country. Right. Therefore, I will be part of that as well. So there's a lot of other things I'm doing, but we believe that, you know, we have to be doing this. We have to support this as not just nationally, but also at European level. And we are one of the few teams that's very, very experienced. Even though we're a small team, there are some core members of the team that have some really good experience. And compared to other teams in Europe, we're one of the few teams that see a lot of autistic individuals, a lot. So we have experience there.
It does sound like you're attempting to do, I'm going to call it a train the trainer model, or changing mindsets by working at entire schools, right? It's the only way you're going to be able to do it is build capacity in people and then hope they don't leave, or make it such a great experience and environment that they don't choose to leave. Is that fair? Is that how you're sort of attacking it?
That's one of the things we do, because if you've got a school and you've got 10 AAC users in there, then it makes sense to, a lot of times the issues of moving something forward aren't related to that one child and their support. It tends to be a whole school attitude or a lack of knowledge or skill. And so therefore, if you don't take that school approach, you're probably not going to succeed anyway in the long run.
Well, Dr. Ajuis, that's exactly what we're trying to do, at least in some places around the States, certainly in my neck of the woods, where not just, you said special schools, we have special classrooms, and actually we do have special schools too. They're usually private schools or privately funded. But the idea is, in general education classrooms, in schools, can we create a culture where AAC, like you said, since it's becoming more and more mainstream and we're using all these different forms of communication, can we make that how it is? Like, this is when you come into our building, there's picture symbols that are related to, you know, and the people that come, more importantly, the people in the building, and including the kids, know what to do. Like, we're just good friends. Here's how you be a good communication partner. This is what we do to support people. And that takes time and effort and training. And it sounds like that's what you're going for as well.
I think we've done it mostly with what I call special schools. They're supposed to be called resource centers, actually. In mainstream, and Malta has a huge percentage of kids in mainstream. Unfortunately, what we would find is that might be only 2 or 3 children in a school who are using AAC, and they're heavily unionized. So it's difficult for us to work with them outside of when they can do trainings, and if they choose to do training on how to use a whiteboard as a school, that might be their priority. Then it means that we're not the priority. What we've done though for schools is we've set up a whole schedule of trainings here in Malta, so that they can then register, and those are going on all year round, if you know what I mean. So that way, we're providing some access to some information, and we're also working with them on how they can set goals, because sometimes around AAC, because one of the issues we're finding is that maybe speech and language therapists aren't in place to do this. And we can't hold on to children beyond, once for us it's assess, support funding, wait for the system, if it's a system, to come in. Once it comes in, we will set it up. We will ensure the child is using it at the early stages, but then we're out. Because otherwise we would get blocked up with too many cases. So then what we decided was, okay, let's see if we can support teachers to start writing IEPs in a better way, because that's sometimes the issue as well.
Definitely. There's all of these issues. So not enough people that know what to do. There's already competing initiatives as far as professional learning goes. There's only so many hours in the day. You've got 6 people on your staff, right? But yet it sounds like you're making progress and inroads, right? I mean, you do have these trainings available and people are signing up for them. Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh, yes. What I would say is we're making loads of progress in terms of outcomes. We have a lot of people here who are using their systems really well. And we're talking about children with physical disabilities, but also ones who have autism. We do have that. So, but I when I look at those people, I think to myself, what was working well? And it will be coming from everyone. You see it from the parents, you see it from the school, you see it then that the child has got the right fit in terms of the system or strategies that we've recommended, and all of it aligns. But in most cases, that's difficult to achieve.
Yeah. And you might have it for a period of time, but then dynamics change. You have a teacher with a speech therapist that has moved on, or something changes. So having that consistently be good is even a smaller number of scenarios, right? Yeah. So I think we've touched on some of these, but let me just make sure we're comprehensive here. So you sort of described what that service delivery looks like. It sounds like a lot of evaluations. So if I was a parent in Malta and I had a kid that I was like, I might need AAC, where do I start? What do I do?
Well, we won't accept referrals now unless they come through from a speech therapist.
Okay. So my first job is to find. Okay.
Yeah. Before we used to, but now we don't. The reason being was that, as I explained earlier, as a team, we assess, and then once the device has arrived or the strategies are in place, we don't stay in for the long haul. And so we didn't want it to feel as if we were forcing speech therapists to accept our recommendations. And it was a kind of case of trying to get them on board. I don't know if you have this issue as well, but if I come in and say, well, I believe this is the right system for this child, and then I'm out, it's not really fair on the speech therapist who's going to have to provide the language implementation or intervention. So we wanted them to become part of the team from the very start. That they're involved. First of all, they know the child way better than we would. Anyway, they've been working with the child or the adult, so they can really contribute to the assessment. And then also, a lot of times you'd be surprised, they have real definite thoughts on, why that display might work better than that one, or that organization of vocabulary, we prefer this to this. You start to work through why that is. But definitely for buy-in, we have to do that. We found that if we didn't do that, that was going to be a problem.
Are your speech therapists employed by the school or the country, or how does that work exactly?
I actually wrote this down on my notes before this interview, but one of the big differences between services that we have and in the US is that our speech therapists are not employed in education. They're employed in health. So very much health model. For the most part, parents take their children out of school to go to an appointment, which is not great for inclusion, right? There are some speech therapists who happen to have rooms in schools, because maybe there wasn't a room locally, but they're not as integrated as I would like to see in the educational system. So yeah, our systems work very different, but you'll find what I'm saying is very common in the UK and in Ireland, as well as Malta. That speech therapy, OT, physio, these are all things that you take your child to, and you take time off work to bring your child to these appointments.
You take time off work. Okay, so I can see that as another barrier.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, just going back to what you said about the selection process, that's something we have adopted in our neck of the woods, where we, just like you said, we used to have a model where someone like me would come in, do an evaluation. I'm putting that in quotes, because it was, and oftentimes it was like sort of a best guess by, hey, I know these three systems. Let me pick what I think might be best and show it to you. And good. Okay. And I've got this long line of other kids that need stuff. So good luck. And then it would never really, or again, it would have to be the perfect scenario, not never, but the perfect scenario of the perfect team with the perfect situation with the perfect mindset to make it really work. And so we've adopted a new system, just like you're describing, not just the speech therapist, though, the teacher, the parents, and what our role is to facilitate the conversation. So we sort of know the questions to ask. Like, we think we want a lot of words on here, right? Like if the person's going to learn a lot, if the student's going to learn a lot of words, then do we all agree with a lot of words? All right, let's put that on the list. Oh, what do we speak at home? Oh, you speak Irish at home? All right, I guess let's make sure we have Irish on the, I'm joking, but you know what I mean? Like whatever the language might be. We become facilitators. What is that? What you're trying to head to is be less of a I'm making the choice and implying it on you, imposing it on you, I guess, and we're making the decision together collaboratively.
Yes, that's our philosophy. We've been that way for years. We've had 10 people in the room before. Right. And it's interesting when you do it that way, what people come up, what they think is important. You mentioned specifically, though, language, and one of our, let's say, threats to Malta is that we don't have text-to-speech in the Maltese language.
Really? Okay.
Yes. So we are lucky to have two official languages here, English and Maltese, but because we don't have Maltese as text-to-speech yet, which is a major issue for anyone with disabilities, actually, because if you think about it, Siri speaks to you in your language, but she can't speak in Maltese. I've said Siri's English as a girl, I don't know if she is, right? But so even when you use Google Maps, it's not going to speak correctly if the name of the road is written in Maltese.
Wow, I had no idea. So this is me checking my assumptions, because I would have just assumed that the world had figured that out, right? Like that every language is text to speech. But
the problem here is you've got minority languages, minority in the sense that maybe only a few people use them. And I suppose 400,000 people speaking this language is just not important.
It seems.
I know.
Well, what it really seems like is an opportunity. Like if there's somebody who's like, I can make some money by figuring out how to, do text to speech, then
I can tell you that in Europe we have funds to put projects together, and we have I'm part of a consortium, let's put it this way, with people from Macedonia, Cyprus, Italy, and Poland, and we put in a project request for designing children's voices for these languages, for these countries, and we won that. So that's a project that's about to start, and I'll finally get a Maltese voice. But you can imagine that as a team, we spend a lot of time recording, huge amounts of time recording things in the Maltese language, because you spend a huge amount of time having a discussion about what's the way forward. And in all honesty, when I have a child in front of me that has good potential, I cannot recommend Maltese at this point in time. And I'll have to say that to the parents and give them time to think about it, because they will not be able to access academic content with Maltese language. And you might say, but can't you record everything in Maltese? No. Maltese is one of those languages that is high morphological in terms of how it changes morphologically. So a verb can have 400 variations. You will not be able to record 400 variations of one word, and you would struggle to represent that visually for a person who can't read. Plus, we use intonation to distinguish meaning. So a question is asked in Maltese language using an intonation that goes up, and the same word would just be a statement. So because of this, we also have other issues, things like the negative, which is a broken negative and wraps around verbs at the beginning and at the end. So and all these things that you can expect. The language is similar to Arabic. Its roots are in the Arabic language. So because of this, as a team, as a therapist, now I get other people to do this for me because I managed to get interns, right? We do a lot of recording in Maltese language, but we spend a huge amount of time just talking about what language is your child going to move forward in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That is blowing my mind. At the beginning of this interview, you mentioned the World Health Organization and how there are these assistive technologies that we would think of sort of universal. No matter what country, wheelchairs are a thing, right? Text-to-speech, in my mind, was on that list, right? Like so, or should be. So the fact that it doesn't exist in Maltese, again, sounds like it's an opportunity for some change.
It is, and we're hoping that change will come. But even when text-to-speech comes, the next question will be, how do you represent visually? I think that's going to be, well, we will see these hopefully in the next years, because I've been campaigning for 15 years for a Maltese voice, right? But that is a huge element of what we do, and a huge element of our discussions. We are lucky that English and Maltese are taught together in primary years, but the majority of people are speaking Maltese now, and that's wrapped around things culturally too. So,
right.
you know, yeah, and I don't know if people may not know this, but Malta is Malta, the mainland, but there's also a small island called Gozo. They're very protective of their culture, and they do speak Maltese as the primary over there. Their own version of it, but it is Maltese. But and they have a right to speak the language that they feel comfortable in at home.
Yeah.
Another thing that makes things a bit more challenging for us is that it's been said that no one speaks English or Maltese. They're all on a continuum between the two. So it's a huge amount of code switching, huge amount. I'm a person who was born in the UK, and I went to school there, and I lived in Ireland. So for me, English is my natural language. But most people brought up in Malta are sprinkling their languages with the other language the whole time, right? So a bit of this and a bit of that. And so that can be quite difficult, I think. It will be challenging to put that into communication aids down the line.
Yeah. It sounds like, well, first, the analogy to what we were talking about earlier about that a person's not broken, the environment is, let's change. And right, same idea here, like you have the right to communicate however you want to communicate, right? So same thing with would you say Goza is the
Gozo,
is we shouldn't have to change for the world. People should adopt our language. Like we shouldn't have to go learn English, right? So I feel like that's just a parallel or metaphorical analogy, you know.
I think, you know, if you think really carefully about AAC systems, they are most prevalent in Spanish and English, probably because America has got those resources to develop those, and it's important. In Europe, a lot of countries have very limited representation in the AAC world. For example, Serbian, Macedonian. If I go to Italy, I know for certain that they are not choosing between multiple vocabularies. They're choosing. They don't barely need a speech therapist because they only have one vocabulary that happens to have been translated into Italian. So that's the one they're going to use. You know, this. So yeah, this maybe is a different perspective on things, but yeah, all these languages exist, and not all of them have got AAC supports. And each country is on its own kind of, is at a different stage in that process of what they have achieved.
And I could see maybe some of the big major players in AAC development thinking, well, I only have so many resources as a company, right? And so how do I prioritize which country do we move into next, right? Which country do I help develop next, you know, in AAC terms or language for? That sounds like a real, again, something I hadn't really wrapped my brain around. I knew, but I didn't know.
This is complicated. Just imagine you've seen somebody, you think he needs Maltese, so you go off and do all the recordings, and then you find out that when you use the Zoom function on or some kind of auditory scanning function on this piece of software, that it reverts back to English.
Yeah.
And he needs that. These kinds of things that you discover along the way, and it's like, oh, right. So you asked me about my work day. As a team, we spend a huge amount of time troubleshooting these kinds of issues as well.
Mm-hmm. It seems like you've done quite a bit of travel and you get around. Do you notice other similarities or differences to how AAC is approached, across the world?
Our team was built on a British model. We had the ACE Centre come out. I don't know if you know them. They came out from the UK and they set up our team. That's how it came to be. And we've continued as therapists in speech and language therapists in Malta tend to follow whatever's going on in the UK. We pay a lot of attention to ASHA, but we also pay a lot of attention to RCSLT in terms of how we work as therapists, our ethos and the way we see things. So pretty much we're working similar to them. But, when I was in Italy and I realized I didn't have speech therapists recommending AAC, teachers do it. I was like, wow. Right. I was recently involved in a project for UNICEF where we were bringing special schools to make them into resource centers. And we were training teachers to do these assessments. So you find that's something I couldn't wrap my head around at first. I thought, there I was thinking the speech and language therapy is the god of all, AAC. And then I find out that different countries see this quite differently. And an AAC person is not always on the team. Mm-hmm. I recently went to a talk about a European project that was funded about making AAC decisions for people with intellectual impairments. And it was psychologists. So you will see that's quite different across Europe. And like I said, the resources available to people can be very different.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does make sense to me that it's an all-in, again, interdisciplinary field, right? Or concept, AAC. Mm-hmm. And I also tend to agree that I think here in the States, we sort of have this bias of who owns it, right? Like, well, we speech therapists own AAC, but right, it's our field. But no, it's everybody's field. And I would say right down to an individual team, there will be some teams where the speech therapist on the team is the most knowledgeable around language and AAC. And then there will be another team where it's the teacher that actually knows way more because this speech therapist didn't go to the same uni or didn't really have the minutes behind them to learn, but the teacher has, And then in other cases, it's the parent. Like the parent actually is the one who's done the most research and has spent, should have a doctorate in language, right? And so, again, the perfect scenario is when everyone has all of that knowledge, right? But I find that it is a mixed bag across different teams. Is that fair?
Yes, our team is OT and speech, transdisciplinary. We're working together to solve the issue at hand. I would say that the OT I work with, she knows as much as I do. When it comes to emergent communication and how to support that, she's brilliant. Where I know more is the linguistic structures, morphology and syntax and those kinds of things. But when it comes to early communicators, she's brilliant. She knows as much as I do, right? And I think that's what we have to be flexible and I don't think it belongs. This field doesn't belong to speech and language anymore. It might have done before, maybe, I don't know. But with the changes in tech that's going on, people getting skilled up. One thing I would say is it's very difficult to keep up with all the different areas of AAC. There are so many different avenues of research, and I believe long-term that this will become a profession of its own.
You mean AAC in general?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're already seeing AT as developing profession in the UK. There's now a master's for that. But I kind of question because we can't keep up with it. There's no way. And now it's not just before you just studied AAC and you did 12 hours, but now you need 12 hours just to understand AAC for autistic individuals. Mm-hmm. You need another 12 hours probably to understand the multifunctionality of AAC systems, which go well beyond face-to-face communication. Mm-hmm. And how is AI going to impact all of this? I'd say that's going to be another thing too that's coming. So long term, I think that we could see people choosing to be AAC specialists from the ground up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, especially now that, I mean, we have podcasts about it and a whole Instagram fleet of people that are specific about AAC. So I think it makes sense to me. People would look at some of these resources and go, oh, but maybe that's my career. Maybe that's my path, you know?
Yeah.
Speaking of like intellectual pursuits, what's something like this? So this is sort of my last question that I like to ask on the podcast, which is, and it might not be our last question, but I like to ask this question is, what are you curious about recently? Like you mentioned AI. What are some other, or maybe it is AI. What are some things that are sort of piquing your curiosity? You're a doctorate, right? You have a doctorate. So are you, what are you curious about?
I'm curious about lots of things. I'm one of those people who's constantly thinking and getting new ideas. I think that I'm most curious right now about AI and how it might change our systems. Will it bring a better user experience? Will it address some of these issues that we have? Because we still don't have the tools that we need. And I think sometimes AAC in itself can be restricting somebody's communication, because maybe what they need isn't really exactly available yet. So I think also the other thing that really interests me is how AAC systems are being used for other things. So for example, tomorrow we have a supplier who's come from Italy to demonstrate to us how his AAC system, so communication aid, can be used to drive a wheelchair. Yes.
Tell me more.
Right. It's called Ombres. And basically this is the communication aid mounted on the chair. And there's always been a problem for eye gazers because they won't be able to see over the chair in order to be able to drive their wheelchairs. But the display itself will be what he looks at in order to drive. The software comes through on the display. If he looks off, the chair automatically stops. And I have a video, lovely video of this, my client trying this out, and he was driving this within seconds.
Wow.
So these things that I don't think, this is why I think that we're going to have to move forward in how we perceive AAC. Speech therapists are no longer, in this field, are not about speech and language therapy. We are now thinking, and you mentioned the holistic person. Now we need to think, what does this person need? And not just speech and language or communicative need, right? But what other things does this person need to do? Because some of those things might be addressed through one system. So that same adult who will drive his chair, and we will be purchasing this for him, he also does work on his communication aid. So he's out of the vocabulary and into Excel sheets and into PowerPoints and into the internet. So now we have somebody who's not just using a system for communication, but using it for many other things. And speech and language therapists cannot stop and say we are only doing this anymore. It's not just about communication. We already talk about literacy and the importance of that, and it is language, but I think we need to start even broadening further now, because I could recommend something worth 10, 15,000 that actually didn't meet a person's need in another area, but could have done.
Right.
But I thought differently at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's even more impetus for having as many people at the table talking about, but what about this function? And what about this need, and making that part of, when I was saying those facilitating questions and I was using a couple examples, imagine all the other questions that could be asked to make it a more overall thought process about what the supports would look like.
Yes. So if you think about the participation model, and at the very top, you have identification of communication needs, right? But participation isn't just about participating from a communicative perspective. It could be participating in employment or in education, and therefore, I think you need to start thinking broader at the start, just in case that this person might need this device for maths, calculator, right? And whether the software is going to allow that or not. Because some do, and so I think, this is what interests me a lot. as a professional. I think that what I started as a speech and language therapist, and now I'm starting to see that I'm moving in a broader direction completely. And you said to me earlier, you started in AT, but it's coming back around to that because all this AT is being integrated now into communication systems.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I often wrestle with the idea of, is it assistive tech, or is it just, again, in this global sense, tech? And these are people that just use technology to help do stuff. Just if you think of it that way, as opposed to maybe something specialized. You mentioned like problem solvers. You know, I'll work with people who work in educational technology. They're good problem solvers. So, okay, what is the person trying to do? Okay, what technology can I match? Whatever their abilities are, right? As opposed to special education. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think a couple of years back, I heard a huge discussion about whether, if you use your phone as an AAC system, was it assistive tech or was it still a mainstream device? It doesn't really matter, does it?
No.
So that in that point, you can say it's just tech. I mean, I like my phone to have big fonts. I am clearly using this because I struggle sometimes to see things that are small. Am I using assistive tech? I don't know. It's part of it. And this is about universal design, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I do think there are limitations of mainstream systems, especially for people who have multiple needs, and especially people who have alternative access methods. And we're not, and we're going straight to dedicated systems just the same. And we find that they are much more functionality in them. Plus, with autistic kids, we found that they were coming back to us within 2 to 3 years after using mainstream tablets, because the batteries weren't keeping up. And I was like, if this had been a dedicated device, I probably would have got 2 more years out of it. So it's like, okay, I saved some money, but now you'll come back in for another, that's all time, isn't it? And now the recommendations being made. So I think these are all decisions we have to think about when we make recommendations.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Whenever I fantasize about just people thinking like it's tech that helps people, so let's find the tech that helps people, and that might be a mainstream device, or it might be something more specialized. It's tech that helps people. What I also hear ringing on my other shoulder, or the little character sitting on my other shoulder, is, yeah, but the systems aren't set up that way, Chris. Like funding is not set up that way, right? So you can't. If we just said, well, that went away conceptually. It's just, we're all people using tech. Funding streams are not set up to support that model yet, right? So you can't just happen that way.
Well, I think the theory is universal design, but is it really possible for something to be designed for everyone? I was at something recently where they were saying, and they were talking about just physical spaces and how they can be designed to support somebody. So somebody with autism who needs a physical space that is a bit calmer. But then, rightly so, someone else said, but what if I have in the same class someone who needs a more alerting environment? And so I think that you want to design something that is for everyone, but sometimes there are competing considerations, and it's not always possible. And it's costly. I think if my phone could be used for AAC and I'm on it 10 hours a day, that's going to make it a lot more expensive from a battery perspective, I'd imagine. And there are limitations to what you can do with that kind of tech, isn't there?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. We could talk about this all day, and I would love to. When will I see you again? Is there a chance you're coming to Communication Matters? Are you coming to ATIA? What does your conference future look like?
My conference for this year is going to be, there's two actually. IALP is coming to Malta.
What's that? I don't know what that is.
International Association of Phoniatrics and something or other. It's a huge speech and language one, but that's a more generalized one. And there is an AAC committee on that, which I'm on. So I will come to that. And there's AAATE, which takes place in Cyprus this year. That's the Association for the Advancement of Assistive Technology in Europe. That's a huge conference, has got an AAC stream, but if you wanted to broaden yourself, then that's one to go to. Not sure if Isaac will ever take place again. That's the one I'm waiting for, to be honest. They haven't announced yet for 2025. If they do, then I'll be at that.
Well, my understanding at this point in time, we're recording in December, is that they were partnering with Communication Matters. Unless that something changed, my thought was those things were going to be integrated. But do you have some inside knowledge here, Dr. Ajuis?
All I can say is that I was at, there's a Bulgarian AAC conference called Assist, which Isaac was supporting. And I can't remember her name. There was the lady who was in charge of Isaac did give a speech and did stop short of saying that there would be a conference next year. So it kind of made me think they are not sure, or they haven't decided, or they're not going to. Which is a shame, because to me it is still the best AAC conference that there is.
Well, the last knowledge I knew, there was a lot of logistics to work out. So those I could imagine, could interfere. So we'll wait and see. We'll see. Maybe by the time this episode airs, we'll have the answers and people can go sign up. Certainly they can sign up and see you. Is there any final thoughts that you have?
I think this was a very nice discussion, because we don't often get to just talk AAC without having a particular case or something in mind. This is just free-flowing chat, and that's been fun. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and I hope I get to see you soon. Let's stay in touch.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.